The war on history, ongoing for years now, has two phases. The first phase is to demonize all of our culture's historical heroes, turn them into cartoon villains, basically, downplay their successes and virtues while emphasizing their shortcomings. And if they did not have enough shortcomings to emphasize, then simply invent evil deeds that they didn't actually commit. And this is easy enough to do. It's not like they're around to defend themselves from the slander, so you can say whatever you want about them. Then tear down their statues, take their names off of buildings, turn them into sources of national shame, whereas before they were sources of national pride. The left has a word, actually, for this first phase. It's problematize, which is to make a problem out of something or someone that was not a problem before. Now, it's safe to say at this point that phase one, the problematization phase, is complete. That moves us to phase two. With the old heroes smoldering on the historical ash heap, their monuments all knocked over and decaying like the Statue of Liberty and the Planet of the Apes, the next step is to replace them with new heroes. And where the old heroes were great men and women who accomplished magnificent and world-changing things, yet also being human, possessed flaws, sometimes great flaws, the new heroes accomplished nothing worthwhile at all. They are selected not because of their achievements, but because of their usefulness, their utility to the leftist cultural narrative. Obviously, the George Floyd murals and statues are the prime example of this. And also this, Indiana University proudly announces on their website today, quote, a new bronze sculpture memorializing Alfred C. Kinsey's significant and enduring contributions to Indiana University now sits on the Bloomington campus, marking the 75th anniversary of the institute that bears his name. Kinsey revolutionized the scientific study of sexual behavior and provoked an international conversation about sexuality. He founded the Kinsey Institute, the world's leading sexuality research institute, in 1947. The life-size bronze is the work of Melanie Cooper Pennington, a lecturer in sculpture in the IU School of Art and Architecture and Design. The sculpture's installation on the Bloomington campus demonstrates the university's pride and the living legacy of research and academic freedom Kinsey helped to forge, and the Institute's ongoing commitment to equity regarding sexual diversity established by Kinsey's research. Equity regarding sexual diversity. Well, that's one way to put it. The other way to put it is that Alfred Kinsey was a deviant lunatic and a pedophile who enjoyed researching, quote unquote, the orgasms of children and babies. The notorious Table 34 from the book Sexual Behavior in the Human Male documents the number of orgasms allegedly experienced by children from the ages of 15 down to 5 months old. And he acquired this information by working with rapists who would abuse children, keep a journal about the experience, and then report back to Kinsey. So in other words, he enlisted pedophiles to rape kids so that he could get the data he wanted. And why did he want this data? Well, because he wished to prove that children are sexual beings from birth, and that all forms of sexual activity, literally all forms, including pedophilia, bestiality, all of it, are legitimate. Now, you can learn more about this in my film, What is a Woman, and where we discuss in more length Alfred Kinsey and also John Money. But this is the man that Indiana University honors with his own statue. He was the most prolific groomer of the 20th century. There's a reason that the left still celebrates him today. But of course, calling them groomers is hate speech. I mean, they're making statues to Alfred Kinsey, but calling them groomers is hate speech. Yet it's not just child-raping psychopaths who we're being told to honor this week. There are also slave traders. We mustn't forget about them. Well, only certain historical slave traders are worthy of our admiration, specifically the ones whose story is being told in a major Hollywood film, which is set to premiere this coming Friday. The movie is called The Woman King. And the absurdity of the title, The Woman King, is really the least of its problems, so we don't even have time to talk about that. The official description on Rotten Tomatoes tells us this. The Woman King is the remarkable story of the Agoge, the all-female unit of warriors who protected the African kingdom of Dahomey in the 1800s with skills and a fierceness unlike anything the world has ever seen. Inspired by true events, The Woman King follows the emotionally epic journey of General Nanisika as she trains the next generation of recruits and readies them for battle against an enemy determined to destroy their way of life. We'll have a little bit more on their way of life and what exactly that way of life was in just a second, but here's a little bit of the trailer. Watch.
Evil is coming. That threatens our kingdom. Our freedom. But we have a weapon. They are not prepared for.
My king, the Europeans wish to conquer us. They will not stop until the whole of Africa is theirs. We must fight back for our people.
Maneska, you are asking me to take them to war.
Some things are worth fighting for.
Don't know, take my power. Don't know, take my power.
You are called to join the king's guard.
Don't know, take my power.
No kingdom in all of Africa shares this privilege. Train hard, fight harder. We fear no one. And we fear no pain. I offer you a choice. Fight or we die.
Now, to be clear, this film is about as historically accurate as, like, the Power Rangers, but we'll get back to that in a second. It's, of course, a foregone conclusion that this movie will be critically acclaimed. It has to be. I mean, it's essentially a matter of law, or might as well be at this point, that a story about female African warriors killing Europeans must be praised in the most rapturous terms possible. Any critic who dares to utter a critique or whose applause is judged to be lacking in enthusiasm will be branded a racist and a sexist. And they'll probably throw transphobe and homophobe in for good measure also. Mainstream film critics, who as a group are some of the most pathetic cowards in all of media, which is really, really saying something, certainly got the memo about this. Reviews of the film were released on Sunday, and The Woman King now boasts a 100% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes. If it keeps going at this pace, which it probably will, it will go down as one of the most best-reviewed films of all time. Right now, it's ahead of like Citizen Kane and The Godfather in terms of its reviews. Critics are saying things like, The Woman King is a sturdy, rousing piece of studio entertainment that makes both the new feel old and the old feel new. Then also, thrilling and enrapturing, emotionally beautiful and spiritually buoyant, The Woman King isn't just an uplifting battle cry. It's the movie that director Prince Bythewood has been building toward her entire career. And then, fierce, furious, and feminine, an action picture that isn't so much released as unleashed. Talk about a movie of its moment. Another critic adds that the movie is so spectacular, so perfect, so wonderful, so miraculous and beautiful, that he's planning to jump out of a window as soon as he submits his review, having decided that his life has reached its pinnacle and there's no point of living anymore. It's all downhill from here. Another one said that watching the movie was more glorious than seeing the birth of his own children. And in fact, after watching the movie, he wishes that his children had not been born because they're white. Now, admittedly, I made up the last two reviews, but they're not very far from what the critics are actually saying. All of this, in spite of the fact that the Kingdom of Dahomey, who are the heroes of this movie, were ruthless killers and slave traders who conquered and murdered in pursuit of slaves, which were then used as labor within the kingdom or sold to buyers outside of the kingdom. As the Encyclopedia Britannica notes, before they edit this passage, which I'm sure they will, the kingdom was not, it's not just that they had slaves, the kingdom was fundamentally organized around war and slavery. That's what the whole thing was about. Quote, Dahomey was organized for war, not only to expand its boundaries, but also to take captives as slaves. Slaves were either sold to the Europeans in exchange for weapons or kept to work the royal plantations that supplied food for the army and court. From approximately 1680, a regular census of population was taken as a basis for military conscription. Female soldiers, called Amazons by the Europeans, served as royal bodyguards when not in combat. So, the transatlantic slave trade could only exist because it was furnished by Dahomey along with other tribes and kingdoms. This is one of the little-known inconvenient facts about African slavery that we've talked about before on this show. It was a system supported, encouraged, promoted, facilitated by Africans themselves. Now, in Dahomey's case, I should be fair, I guess, and admit that they didn't always sell their captives into slavery. Sometimes they would, instead of selling them, butcher them in human sacrifice rituals. Human sacrifices were killed for various rituals to honor kings, and then also there were other forms of human sacrifices, like the concubines of a king would be killed and buried with him when he died, those sorts of things. Now, naturally, all indications are this movie does not really grapple with any of these unfortunate historical realities. On the contrary, they paint the female warriors of Dahomey as freedom fighters. According to one review I read, they do acknowledge that the kingdom had slaves, but they pretend that the woman warriors were abolitionists, that they were pushing for the end of the slave trade, which is pure fiction, of course. Actually, not only is it fiction, but the slave trade only ended in the kingdom of Dahomey because British blockades forced it to end. Here's another inconvenient fact. Europeans abolished the slave trade above the objections of many African and Middle Eastern nations. So Europeans said, you're not doing this, none of us are doing slave trade anymore, it's done. While many African and Middle Eastern nations said, no, we want to keep doing the slave thing because it's profitable to us. Now, as for the woman warriors of Dahomey, they were easily crushed in their first military engagement with the French. And that was the end of that story. Now, look, there's nothing on the surface wrong with, making a movie that fictionalizes historical events. But it is unthinkable, of course, that anything like this could ever be produced, much less receive rave reviews, if the roles were flipped around. Imagine a Civil War movie where the Confederates are not only the heroes of the film, but are portrayed as the true abolitionists. That movie could not possibly exist. And if it did exist, there would be literal riots in the street. I mean, it's not an exaggeration to say there would be riots. The buildings would be burning if a movie like that came out. Any theater that was crazy enough to play it would be burned to the ground. Except that wouldn't even be on par with this film because the Confederates were not nearly as brutal as the Kingdom of Dahomey was. But this is all a part of our cultural rewrite of history. Some men who had slaves were bad, no matter what else they did. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, no matter what else they did, even as the founders of our country, they had slaves, so we got to tear down their statues. They were scumbags, that's it. While other people who organized their whole societies around the capture, sale, and ritualistic murder of slaves were good and deserving of their own hagiographical films. So once again, our culture designates new heroes for us. And those new heroes might be criminals, drug addicts, child rapists, even slave traders. Not much to admire there, but we're told to admire them all the same. Well, before you go, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell. And while you're at it, if you want to go watch or listen to my full show, head to dailywire.com and subscribe. You can also catch my show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. So go check it out now. I demand it. Your compliance is somewhat appreciated.